Welcome to today's webinar, Considerations of Flipping to a Delaware C Corporation. I'm Gabby Ababa, Growth Marketing at Atrium, and your moderator for today. And now I'll pass it off to Jason, our speaker for today, to introduce himself and dive into the content.
Thanks, Gabby, and hello, everyone. Welcome. As Gabby said, my name is Jason. I'm an attorney over at Atrium. I work with the general counsel team, and so my practice ranges from counseling companies at various stages in their life cycle and assist them with anything from incorporation through financing and potentially an exit if they're so lucky, and just a lot of different stuff in between. And one thing, we've had to do a lot at Atrium is flips, obviously, because we work with a lot of Y Combinator companies and venture-backed companies in general, and it's largely a requirement of those to be Delaware C-Corps. And sorry, before my time at Atrium, I was at Covington & Burling in their general corporate group, doing everything from kind of similar practice to what I have now. So we thought that this would be a really great webinar in order to bring a lot of collective knowledge together and help founders become better educated when they're making, whether it's an incorporation decision or just deciding to flip, and understanding sort of all the implications that come with flipping, whether it's early in your life cycle, later, and why you can potentially save yourself a lot of pain and headache if you plan to be sort of the typical venture-backed model with starting as Delaware C-Corp rather than potentially as a Delaware, like an LLC or some other state's form of corporation. So let's get started. Today's discussion is pretty much going to be revolving around the pros and cons of the Delaware C-Corp and getting into why you might flip. And then we'll talk also about why you decide to flip, what to consider when making this decision, what the process of flipping looks like. I'll touch a little bit on maybe if you're an international founder coming to the U.S., but that's sort of a whole nother bag of worms that we should save for a later day, but happy to answer some brief questions on that. And then one question that we need to answer a lot is, do you actually need to flip, or can you potentially just start over? And then we'll end with some Q&A. All right. So corporations versus an LLC, just some basics. I'm sure a lot of you out there might already know the answers to these questions, but for some of you, let's just discuss sort of the key differences. One of the main reasons why people might actually want to start with an LLC is because it's a pass-through entity for tax purposes. So this means that initial revenue that comes through the door doesn't actually have like a corporate level tax, which a corporation is subject to. And that's why you might hear a term called double taxation when people talk about corporations. But with an LLC, it's a pass-through tax entity. So this means that the tax only applies at the member level. Whereas with a corporation, you have it at the corporation level and also at the stockholder level. The problem with this for LLCs, though, I'll get into later, is that there's greater tax nuances, especially as you scale your company when you're comparing things to what you might experience as a stockholder in a corporation. Other things that can be a benefit in sort of very specific industries or business models is that LLCs are highly customizable. So this might seem like a positive, but in a venture-backed model, it's not necessarily the greatest option because it's going to oftentimes, as you scale, require a lot more customized legal work, and this will largely increase your legal costs because a lot of the typical corporate startup firms here in the Bay Area are, their pricing and playbooks are going to revolve around you being a Delaware C-Corp. So to the extent that they have to go in sort of customize all of their documents for an LLC, that's just going to take them a lot more time. And then another thing that is nice about an LLC compared to a corporation is it's a lot less paperwork to get put together in order to form it. And like I said, these types of entities are much more specific. LLCs are much more geared toward, for sort of a single business owner, or maybe you're in the real estate or in the investment kind of space. So then let's start getting into why a company might decide to flip to Delaware. And I've kind of already touched on these points in the prior slide, But Delaware, just generally speaking, has a really, really robust body of not just statutory law, but case law. So the courts there are super favorable when it comes to litigating disputes that involve corporate law. Whereas in a lot of other states, you might find, like even including in California, people don't really form companies that are California entities unless there's very specific reasons for doing so. And so you'll notice that a lot of the corporate law, if you were to go do some research, it's actually kind of hard to find a lot of answers. Whereas if you go do a lot of research in Delaware, the answers are very readily available just because they've spent a lot of time thinking through a lot of these issues that often come up when you're running a company. And then also just something that a lot of people don't think about is just the Secretary of State in Delaware just really knows what they're doing. And so it's very easy to interact with them when you're just doing simple things like making filings, whether it's, has to do with just amending your certificate of incorporation or doing a conversion or a merger, things like that. Whereas you might have some weird, wonky requirements if, like, you're, for example, a Pennsylvania company, and there might be all this extra paperwork that you need to do that, is really unnecessary. It's just because it's an antiquated system that they have not taken the time to advance, considering, today the modern sort of business needs of companies. And then, as I was kind of touching on before with LLCs, it's fine if you're a smaller business owner where, you're really maybe some family members and one or two investors, and that's pretty much going to be it for the lifetime of your business. So you don't have to worry about scaling, the amount of members who are going to be in your company, investors and employees you're going to issue equity to. But with, a typical startup model, those numbers start to increase really, really quickly. And so with LLCs, it gets really difficult to sort of manage all of those people and customize all of your paperwork. And especially on the tax side, for example, even though it's because it's a pass-through entity, as you get more members in your LLC, that means now you have to be issuing K-1s, which is the tax document in terms of profits and losses each member in your LLC will be allocated for tax purposes at the end of every year. So that becomes a pretty daunting task. Let's say you have, between 200 people on your cap table. Keeping track of that is it's a huge burden. And then, another thing that's really can be difficult is, like, let's say you go raise a safe. You can't just pull Y Combinator's safe off of their website because that's geared toward an investment in a corporation. So if you want to go and use that and do a safe investment in an LLC, that now means you need to customize that document accordingly. So, for example, you couldn't just go plug your LLC name in, put an investor's name on the signature block, and that won't work. So whereas if you're a corporation, that's pretty much all you need to do when it comes to the safe with a few other nuances. So just kind of an example of additional increased legal costs that you'll have to encounter. And also, one thing is most corporate lawyers really are going to be familiar with Delaware, whether they're barred in California or in another state, just because Delaware is so widely used. If you're going to ask somebody, for example, to work with a company that, is based in another state, it makes things much more complicated because, they might not even be able to represent you due to just not being barred there, or just it's not as efficient because they're not going to get familiar with the law. And then another thing that becomes problematic is a lot of institutional investors, so like your typical VC funds, are not willing to invest in an LLC. And that could just be their fund documents don't allow them to, or just a fund policy because they don't want to deal with the issue of getting that K-1 that I was just discussing and having profits and losses allocated to them at the end of every year. And additionally, when they're used to doing, when you have, especially the larger funds, hundreds of deals a year, or, even like 20 or 30, and they're used to doing them all, and they have their way of negotiating things based on a Delaware C-Corp, and now you're asking them to do it for an LLC, they're all of a sudden increasing the transactional costs and whether this is a deal that potentially is worth doing for them. So there's no point in making fundraising efforts a little bit more difficult. And then lastly, Delaware C-Corps are just much more scalable than an LLC. So, for example, as I was kind of talking about before, as you get more members in an LLC, there's a lot more compliance burden and just customization that needs to happen in order to do it. Not to say that you can't. It's just, it's going to be added costs and much more complex. So one thing that I don't think a lot of founders necessarily think about right away is they all realize, we're probably going to have to issue equity to employees in the future, but doing that in an LLC has just so many different tax variables, and there's different ways to do it, that it becomes a huge administrative nightmare. And you can actually potentially create a lot of problems for your employees depending on how you structure your equity incentive plans. When it comes to doing a flip to a Delaware C-Corp in the future, that could end up with those employees being wiped off the cap table and then having to potentially, for example, give them options after the flip. So if anybody ever sort of tells you, oh yeah, it's super easy to do equity incentive plans in LLC, maybe for that specific specialist, they might be very, very good at handling it. But even so, you have to be very cautious, because if you do foresee a Delaware C-Corp in your future, it means that you need to be even more understanding of all of those tax implications and negative effects you could have on your employees when it comes to flipping later. All right. So then, kind of touched on a lot of this in the last slide, but some considerations you might want to think through as to whether, flipping to a Delaware Corp is the right decision for your company. So, as you kind of heard me say throughout this presentation so far, is like venture-backed model, venture-backed model, venture-backed model. And there are great businesses out there that are a Delaware LLC or some other form of LLC, because, they're not really going to go out and raise funds. They might be bootstrapping their company until some sort of liquidity event, or it's, for example, some sort of family business where you're just going to be, you want to have a lot of the pass-through tax benefits. You're going to be giving yourself distributions over time. Well, that's fine for an LLC, and that's why it has a lot of benefits. But if you are going to go out and raise and be a venture-backed model, it's pretty imperative that from the beginning you set the foundation well, so that you're not really putting any roadblocks in front of you, especially when it comes to legal work, to make yourself attractable for investment. Because one thing we do notice with some investors is they do get pretty frustrated when they're like, okay, this person's company is an absolute mess. What does that say about the founders and their willingness to stay organized and just make things easy on everybody? So really understanding, like, I want to be a venture-backed company, then you should grow and start your company like you're planning on being a venture-backed company. And we've kind of touched on the pass-through tax implications, but there's a lot of tax problems that can come when it comes to converting to a Delaware corporation. But beforehand, like, founders love the fact saying, hey, I can form an LLC today, take all these losses on my personal tax returns, and when the time comes, I can flip to a Delaware C-Corp when it's ready. And people do that all the time, and that's usually where we run into a lot of these tax problems, because founders might take a bunch of convertible notes at the beginning, for example, which is debt to the LLC, and all of a sudden they're taking a large amount of losses on the personal tax returns. But when you actually flip to a Delaware C-Corp, depending on what the status is, the value of the assets are of the LLC, you could run into a situation where the founders and any other members of the LLC receive like a form of debt forgiveness. And so then that can cause founders to actually incur personal income and have to pay taxes in connection with that conversion. Another thing is, how complicated is it going to be if we're switching from an LLC to a Delaware C-Corp? If you already haven't really done any employee equity, then it's not really an issue. But the reason that a lot of founders do switch to Delaware C-Corp is when they get the analysis of what it really takes to issue equity, whether it's restricted units, what's called profits interest. So restricted units is kind of like receiving restricted common stock in a company, in a corporation. But in an LLC, units are like what we would call stock in a corporation. But when you start getting into some of the weirder stuff, so for example, profits interest, these are sort of a right to participate in the company's profits once you clear, for example, a certain hurdle rate. So if profits interest has a hurdle rate of $1 million and the company has a liquidity event that's $1 million, that employee actually would get zero participation in that liquidity event, because in order for that employee to participate, the amount of money proceeds received from this liquidity event would have to exceed $1 million. So when you get sort of complex like that, when you flip to a corporation, trying to value that profits interest into what it would actually translate into stock becomes a huge problem. And this is sort of where you start to see issues of employees being wiped off the cap table and having to, for example, receive options instead of maybe they could have just had restricted stock from the beginning had you formed the company as a corporation rather than an LLC. So you can potentially put your employees at a disadvantage by starting as an LLC. And then another thing that some clients might consider, they're like, hey, I'm a California corporation already. I really need to flip to a Delaware corporation. And, venture funds will sometimes still invest in California corporations because it's not as, it's not the same issues as investing in an LLC, but you're still going to somewhat close off yourself to receiving investment from some of the larger funds just because they do so many deals. They just don't want to deal with having to change their deal docs unless there's some really, really, really high potential investment for them. So you're still going to somewhat be narrowing down the pool of potential investors. And then one other consideration as well is, for example, a California corporation technically cannot convert into a Delaware corporation. So the transaction is actually a little bit different when it comes to, depending on what kind of entity types of your non-Delaware corporation flipping into a Delaware corporation. That could mean that you're doing more of a merger transaction rather than a conversion, which is not necessarily that complex, but there's some different considerations as to how that gets structured. And in terms of the time, effort, and cost and things. So some founders say, oh, it's not worth it, and maybe we'll hold off. And then just a quick note on international companies. Technically, and you might see this on some domestic sort of reorganizations, restructurings, where someone might have an LLC that has assets in it, and they don't fully want to flip into a Delaware Corp. So they might do some form of equity swap. So membership interest in the LLC will be swapped for stock in the corporation. LLC will become, for example, a wholly owned subsidiary of the corporation. So you'll see this, we do this a lot for international YC companies actually, because they need to, basically have a Delaware corporation to take U.S. investment. And from an international founder perspective, you just need to be very cautious as to how you structure those transactions. It's basically a share exchange, but there are international tax considerations you need to make sure you're discussing with your local counsel, whether it's in, we've done this for Argentinian companies, Singapore companies, Colombia, sort of, Mexico, all over the place, France. And every country has different tax considerations locally, and whether, the founders or any potential investors that are foreign could become taxpayers in the U.S. and how that's going to affect the transaction. So just want to make sure that, whoever you loop into your team in the future, make sure that you have tax professionals, because on the international tax issues, it can get quite complex. Okay, so now the general process of flipping. So before we can even do the flip, or in the case of, for example, you're doing a California corporation or a Delaware corporation, a merger, we have to make sure that the existing entity is cleaned up. And really what we're really focusing on is the cap table, because we don't want to take a cap table we're not sure about and flip an entity, and then there's all these disputes over who owns what. And we've seen this happen so many times where we've gotten founders, and it's turned into huge founder disputes actually, where founders decided that they didn't want to pay us to do the flip. They did their own flip and then didn't document anything properly before the flip. Then there was a founder separation and a huge debate over who owned what percentage of the company. And the founders ended up spending probably $10,000, $12,000 on lawyers' fees to just negotiate this settlement over who would own what and who was going to stay at the company and whatnot. And when they could have probably paid us, a third of that to do a very simple conversion from the beginning and document everything properly. So that's the importance. And so if your lawyer says, hey, we got to clean all this stuff up, it's going to cost this kind of money, you should really listen seriously, because it can create a lot of issues by not having it properly documented before the conversion. So once the cleanup's done and everybody's confident and agreed on what the cap table is, then assuming this is a simple conversion, really you're just going to basically you get your corporate approval, so it's an LLC, and let's say it's managed by just the members. The members consent to do the conversion. There'll be a plan of conversion explaining whose membership interest will convert into how many shares of stock, for example. And then once that's approved, you will file a certificate of conversion with the state of Delaware. And then that certificate of conversion attached to it will have the certificate of incorporation for your new Delaware entity. And so once that's all filed, you're technically now, and it comes back approved from the state, your entity has been converted. And then you proceed with the post-incorporation setup. One thing, there's a little nuance in here with the entity cleanup that you might run into, as I kind of touched on before. Like, let's say your LLC has raised $500,000 in convertible notes, and you had maybe some warrants that came along with those. And right before you go to flip, you realize, wait, our debts actually exceed our liabilities, so we're going to have that founder debt forgiveness issue. One thing that can really complicate, and this is partially why LLCs can get really tricky if you don't fully understand, maybe why, if you plan to be a venture-backed model, you really should start as Delaware Corporation, is now all of a sudden we have to go back to these note holders and say, hey, we need to actually force convert you into preferred units of the LLC before we flip the LLC, because if not, all of the members, and like there was, for one of these companies that it was a real problem for, there was about 30 people already on their cap table that held equity. So the founders were like, we can't just go back to these members and say, hey, are you guys okay taking this tax hit? And for some of the founders, the tax hit would have been like $20K each, and some were, it was probably around that for income tax problems that they were going to have. And so what we ended up having to do is, and this is largely what takes a long time, is go to 20 convertible note holders, get them all to approve to convert their convertible notes to preferred equity of the LLC, negotiate what those rights would look like. Then you go through the typical process, again, plan a conversion, all of that. But that was a huge problem because it just ended up making it something that if you're a simple flip, you can get it done in maybe a week or two. This ended up being like a 3-month-long transaction because of all the additional complications that it adds when you add a lot of operating history onto an LLC, especially when it comes to the assets versus debt analysis. Okay, so now process continued. Certificate of conversion's been filed. Technically, the new entity is formed. You're a Delaware Corporation formally. Now you really just sort of go through the motions of setting it up. So formally, technically, once the plan of conversion has actually been filed and everything's approved by the state, all the stock in the new entity is considered issued. But usually you will go through the motions of having everybody sign formal, like, for example, restricted stock purchase agreements, or if the equity was not subject to vesting before the flip, you may want to revest founders or other employees, so you might make them sign stock restriction agreements. And another really important thing is to consider the tax implications of whether the equity was subject to vesting before and remains subject to vesting after, or even if you take it away, you still likely will need to file 83B elections for everybody again. So as I've kind of been implying, it's very important that whoever you do engage to handle these kinds of transactions, you really need to make sure that you have good tax advice on all of this stuff, because you can potentially create a lot of problems before and after the conversion if you're just not aware of the issues. So once sort of the post-incorporation setup, everything's kind of sort of cleaned up, you'll go and you're ready to go. You'll qualify to do business in whichever states you're doing business in. And from there, hopefully everything's fully clean and you're home free and can really start with that strong foundation and go raise money from venture funds like everybody wants to do. So now let's sort of talk about whether you actually need to flip. And this can be sort of a more nuanced analysis than, founders like, oh, I really haven't done anything. I'm not going to call a lawyer. I'm just going to go start a new company. Oftentimes what can happen is you may have an entity, you open up a bank account with that entity, maybe you raised $100,000 or something like that, and maybe you signed a lease somewhere, you have some other assets, but you're like, oh, I really haven't made any money in this business. Can't we just go start over rather than going through the whole conversion process? And depending on sort of like how you raise that money, you might be able to do that, but it does become problematic because you got to go get investor approval still to assign all of their investment over, and you may have to do some kind of asset purchase sort of restructuring in case you have any IP that's been assigned in. But in the instance where maybe you truly have an empty shell, you open a bank account, but there's no money in it, or it's very, very immaterial amounts of money, the founders haven't assigned any IP over to the LLC, you likely can just go form a new Delaware corporation and start from the beginning. Founders can assign all their IP and sort of just dissolve that old LLC. And sometimes it actually can be easier, rather than doing a conversion, to form a new entity and do a form of an asset purchase of the old LLC's assets. But that also is a very important analysis, because what can get tricky with doing asset purchases is really making sure that the assets that are being purchased are well defined. So when we get into an analysis of what really is core and material IP, making sure that that has truly been transferred, it's more of like an issue when it comes to diligence of future investors. They're going to want to really feel comfortable that the company that they're investing in really owns the assets that are material to the company's core business, and that there aren't any doubts in that respect. And so the reason why it's really important to, even if you choose not to flip, to loop a lawyer for this conversation, is because we've seen it where founders have been like, oh, I'm just going to go start a new company and pretend like the other one doesn't exist. And there have been disputes, whether it's investors felt wrong because they were left behind, or questions over which company actually owned the IP, or what's happened is like one founder leaves and says, oh, well, I have a right to both companies, and just making sure that those issues are kind of worked out before you kind of proceed willy-nilly, because while a lot of things can be fixed at the end of the day, sometimes you might cause yourself more headache if you don't just slow down and at least give a lawyer a 30-minute, an hour-long call to see if what you really need to consider makes sense, or if you can just kind of go form your own entity and you don't need to do anything super intense on the legal side. So yeah, that is that. On to Q&A.
Cool. Thanks, Jason. That was really thorough. We've gotten a ton of questions, so bear with us as we get through some of these. So first question, should I wait until I'm ready to raise my Series A before flipping?
Yeah, no, that is a good question. And I've heard founders get that advice, and you can wait. Like, I'm not saying you couldn't flip then, but by the time, if you're about to raise a Series A, you're going to have a lot of operating history. You're going to have a much more complex cap table. I'm sure you're going to have raised convertible notes or safes already. Maybe you did a small price round, and there's going to be a lot of assets in the business. So it's going to make that flip transaction invariably much more complex. So the last thing as a startup that you will ever want to do is delay getting money in the bank. So if you have the opportunities to do it early as possible, because you're going to do the venture-backed model, then there's no point in waiting till right before you do the Series A, because you're probably going to add another few weeks, month, or even more to that fundraising timeline before that new Series A money will come in. And you're adding a much more complex flip transaction for those Series A investors to diligence. So I don't personally see the value in putting that to chance if you can do a much simpler conversion early in your life cycle than later in your life cycle.
Cool. Yeah, that makes sense. On to the next question. Why is it so hard to do an equity incentive plan in an LLC?
Yeah, so I already kind of touched on this, but it's really just sort of all the different tax variables you have to consider. It really just isn't scalable. So like, let's say you have 100 employees and they're all members of your LLC. Every year you're going to have to be allocating them their profits and losses of what they're for that LLC and issue them a K-1. So it just becomes a real accounting nightmare. And then let's say you get to a point where people can't actually purchase equity in your in your business, as I kind of touched on, another thing that some companies will use are what's called profits interest. And that's sort of gets complicated as well, because now your liquidation waterfall becomes super complex if, you sell your company to really understand who's going to get paid out what and who's going to participate at what level. So whereas with a corporation, this is all pretty standardized and kind of puts everybody on similar footing, because everybody kind of will hold sort of the same classes of stock for the most part, and you can it's a lot more predictable.
Cool. We spoke a little bit about international companies. This question is relating to that. How does IP ownership work between the U.S. entity and foreign entity?
Yeah, I mean, this also depends on sort of where operations ultimately will end up. But usually what will happen is we have a lot of international clients that come to the U.S. to raise funds. And then they'll have a lot of, a core amount of their operations still back in, for example, Argentina or in the UK. And so what will end up just happening is the U.S. entity, there might be a few employees in the U.S. All IT will probably sit, it can sit in the Delaware company or whichever company it sits in, but basically you have like a consulting relationship where IP will flow back to whichever entity is really using the IP. So, for example, we recently did a transaction where a UK entity wanted to keep the UK business as the parent, and then the Delaware was really going to be useful, not as much for fundraising, but more so for they wanted to hire a sales team here. And so in that instance, all the IP in the Delaware entity would actually flow back to the UK entity in exchange for the Delaware entity's consulting services. So there's some nuance to how that gets structured with potential transfer pricing issues, which, that issue has to do with like fair market value rates on what you're charging between related entities. But yeah, I think that sort of sums it up.
Yeah, that makes sense. You stated that during the flipping process, a company needs to qualify the Delaware C-Corporation in other states where it conducts business. If a company is selling an app, do they need to qualify it in every state that the person may potentially use that app?
No, we really just say sort of like where you're actually where your employees are sitting, you have an office, that kind of thing.
Cool. Yeah, makes sense. So why not?
For example, most sorry, Gabby. Like most companies in SF are just qualified in California, that are based in SF are qualified in California, unless you're really materially have boots on the ground in all of these different states. That becomes a different analysis.
Cool. Yeah, that makes sense. Why not just be an S-Corp until a company gets investors?
Yeah, I should have touched on this earlier. This is actually this is an interesting nuance. And founders can definitely be an S-Corp, and then when they're ready, switch to being a C-Corp. But the issue with this is you really only can do that switch once. So, and then you're locked in for 5 years. But what will happen is, even if you're already an S-Corp, S-Corps who don't know, basically you set it up like a corporation and you make it for tax purposes an S-Corp election. And this allows the stockholders in the corporation to basically treat the corporation as a pass-through entity. But the difference with an S-Corp and a C-Corp is that an S-Corp can only have 100 shareholders. None can be foreign citizens, and none of those shareholders can be an entity. So that's why, if, for example, a VC fund were to invest in an S-Corp, it couldn't do that. And that would automatically, once that VC fund were to hold equity in the S-Corp, it would automatically switch the S-Corp to a C-Corp. But what really is the more important tax consideration here is that once you flip from an S-Corp to a C-Corp, you're potentially running into blowing your QSBS status. So for those that don't know what QSBS is, it stands for Qualified Small Business Stock. And it's basically a tax benefit to founders and common stock and other shareholders in the company that it sets a certain threshold that on the sale of a company, for example, on the sale of that stock, you won't actually pay income tax on a certain portion of that stock, or nor capital gains tax. So it's really beneficial. So when you go from an S-Corp to a C-Corp, any S-Corp stock that's exchanged for C-Corp stock, which is automatic. So if you already hold S-Corp stock, and you switch to a C-Corp, that will be an exchange. You will potentially blow that QSBS status, and that new C-Corp stock that you hold is no longer QSBS eligible. So for founders, this can be a really big problem because they may not realize it, switch to being a C-Corp, and then all of a sudden, find out when they go to sell their company later, oh, we blew that status and didn't even know it just because they didn't have the right corporate counsel or tax counsel involved who's aware of this issue. There are unique sort of like nuanced ways to structure around this where the founders in the S-Corp, can basically form a new C-Corp and drop that down, and the S-Corp will own a certain amount of shares in the C-Corp, and those QSBS benefits could flow through to the S-Corp shareholders. But there's a lot of nuance that goes into setting up that structure, and it gets quite complicated. So we always advise founders, unless you have a ton of money that you're really trying to offset losses against, it might not really be beneficial to start with an S-Corp.
Cool, yeah. Next question. So if a company's goal is to have business licenses in California and Delaware, does it matter which one they register with first?
Well, once you form your company in Delaware, you're already registered there. So then the next step is to qualify in whatever state you're going to be, actually transacting business in, if I understand the question correctly.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. It goes along with the other questions we've kind of gone through earlier. And moving on to one of the last questions that I think we have time for. If they've missed filing an 83B, what's the best or cheapest way to solve it? I know we have some resources online about this, but can you speak to it a little bit?
So are you asking like how to fix a missed 83B election?
Yeah.
Is that what it is?
Yep.
So there's a couple different ways you can fix it, and it really depends. It's a bit of a facts and circumstances analysis. But to back up a little bit, essentially, when you receive restricted stock, the reason you have to file an 83B election is because what you're saying is, hey, I paid for the shares today, and the delta, and I want to be taxed on the difference between fair market value between what I paid for the shares. I want to be taxed on the delta between what I paid for the shares and fair market value of those shares. And since you paid on day one fair market value for those shares, you're saying the 83B election accelerated this tax today, so there's no delta there, so you don't pay any tax. But what happens when you receive restricted stock, if you don't file an 83B election, every time that stock vests, so for example, on your 1-year cliff, you will incur income tax equal to the value of the delta between the original purchase price on those shares and what the fair market value is at the time of vesting. And then each monthly vesting after that, it's the same issue. So the 83B prevents that problem from happening. So depending on where you are in your vesting cycle, the consequences could not actually be as bad. So for example, depending on what the vesting, let's say you haven't hit your 1-year cliff yet, you can potentially still avert this problem of having an income tax issue. And what we do is, even if you have hit your 1-year cliff, you're now at a point where it's like, okay, you're going to have to look into how much income tax you owe, but you can still stop that bleeding by doing the same fix that you would do even if you hadn't hit your cliff. It's just that the consequences are different because you address the problem sooner rather than later. But essentially what we do is we change the vesting schedule within your restricted stock purchase agreement so that for purposes of the tax code, it's no longer considered to be subject to like vesting or substantial risk of forfeiture. And there's a couple different ways to amend that language, but if you speak to any of the Atrium lawyers, they'll know exactly what to do.
Cool. Thanks, Jason. All right, that's just about time now. I know there's a ton of other questions that have come through. If you guys would like to follow up and speak with someone at Atrium, please reach out to hello@atrium.co. And we'll also be sending out a recording of this webinar that's overlaid with the presentation for on-demand viewing at any time. We also have a new guide to incorporation that we'll be sending out along with the recording. Thank you all so much for attending, and have a good one.